All right. Well, Sarah, I just wanted to show you as HR how to work our new strategy component and kind of walk you through the three major groups here. As you'll see at the top, there's the guidelines, the budgeting, and the cost analysis tabs. Before I get started, I just wanted to kind of start with this guidelines page. I think you might be, wondering, like, as you may have just gotten some notice from Bridge that we're setting these default guidelines. So first, I wanted to go over what that means and what our defaults are for this page. That top one, you'll see that H-1B sponsorship. New H-1B sponsorship, it's going to default to immediately. That means that for your F1 employees, L1 employees, J1s, and a few other visa types, we're going to immediately open a projected case for that individual based on the next upcoming H-1B lottery. So it's going to show those projected cases, especially for clients, if I notice has a lot of F1 OPT employees, you're going to start seeing those pop up on your F1 employees' timelines as a part of their kind of projected next case that we're going to complete. Next on that list is going to be this green card sponsorship. Pretending that you do have formal guidelines here. The default is going to be a 1 year for the green card sponsorship. What that means is that based on what we've seen in our industry is that in order to be competitive, we've gauged that the 1 year mark of employment is when it's the best time to start that green card process. Feel free to toggle that differently. We advise clients in certain markets to really adjust that depending on what they think is competitive for their industry and their location. If you're in San Francisco, for instance, it might make a little bit more sense to toggle that and obviously have these discussions if you don't have a set immigration policy in place already, but it's going to be important to kind of gauge what's going to keep your employees interested in accepting a new job offer, but then also to retain them and stay with your company. If you, for instance, use the 4 year mark and you're in San Francisco, you might have a hard time keeping any of your employees engaged and staying with your company because you're not really showing that, that urge to help them with their immigration matters. Beyond that, with the extension or renewal, that default is going to be the 6 month mark. That's just basically what we have always been doing is kind of setting that reminder to start a case at the 6 month mark, which for many visa types is when you can actually legally file an extension or a renewal. This is going to help us ensure that we're not missing anything and that we have enough time to really prepare everything and get that filed so that we don't have any gaps in work authorization or status. And then for H-1B transfers, we want to gauge what you're comfortable with as an employer as to when an H-1B transfer employee can start with your company. All of these options are legally, allowable, but there is a comfort level for both you and the employee. What our default is that the employee will start upon government receipt confirmation. And there's going to be that receipt notice for premium processing that will be emailed, otherwise that will be mailed. If you're or if you're more risk averse, you may want to wait for government approval. Obviously, that's going to depend on H-1B transfer processing times, which we'll be sure to continue updating you on. But that may cause some issues with, a hiring manager expecting someone to start because H-1Bs may take several months for approval. All right, and then going into the fees, we want to go over our defaults here. So for the first one, we're going to cover all fees for the employee only. It's going to be the default. And that's saying that we're going to cover both filing fees and preparation fees for each case for the employee. What this doesn't entail is the dependents, their spouse or their children. They'll have to cover those costs on their own. Whereas if you mark that cover only the required fees, that's going to put some of those potentially, depending on the visa type, that may also require the employee to pay certain portions of the actual fees that are entailed for their own case, let alone their dependents as well. That may include premium processing, for instance, which we'll go into a little bit more detail in the next question. But I just wanted to mention those three options and kind of why we default to the cover employee only fees. For premium processing, our default's going to be that there are no formal guidelines. Right now, obviously, USCIS has suspended premium processing, but if you do mark this cover premium processing whenever it is available as an option, it's basically going to use logic to apply that premium processing fee on each case moving forward where we can file that I-907 request for premium. Setting no formal guidelines is basically just going to default to the position intake that you complete at the beginning of each case so that you can indicate that because of the unique situation of this case, we'd like to do premium processing. But for this extension where we're not really urgently needing a decision, maybe we'll hold off and save that fee and not pay that right now. Then you can also default to never cover premium processing, which we can then discuss, obviously, if you're comfortable, allowing the employee to add that fee on themselves and pay for that separately, as I mentioned here. Then that dependent coverage, our default's going to be that the employee covers all dependent fees. You can change this, and we give several nuanced versions of what you're going to cover for dependents, but this will encompass all dependents, whether it be spouse or children. The default is that the employee will have to pay for all of that, but you can, on the other end of the spectrum, pay for everything for the dependents. This is going to depend on the case specific. For like a consular case, there very well may not be any fees involved. However, if you're doing the I-485, there may be several different fees involved, including work authorization as well, that you may be covering if you do choose that option. And then these in the middle give you a little bit more of a variance in terms of what you will cover specifically. Any questions about the guidelines and what our defaults are?
Yes. So can my employee see these guidelines?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're going to change this active button to indicate a little bit more succinctly. It's going to show that visible to employees. So if you activate this button, it is going to show on the projected timelines for each individual. If it's not active, though, it will only show for you as the HR person, as well as the Bridge CS individual and the attorney working with you. So that really, we advise obviously activating it if you do have a set formal immigration policy. I think it's a great way to really add some transparency there and really set clear expectations of what you're planning on doing for each individual employee. It really decreases on the amount of questions you're going to see from employees. And again, transparency is clear. And we found that employee experience is obviously really important at Bridge. And we obviously strongly suggest that to really cut down on any kind of ambiguity as to what you're planning on doing for an employee. If you're not comfortable or if you don't have a set immigration policy, definitely feel free to toggle that to inactive so that it doesn't show up and it's only active, appearing for the rest of us.
Thanks, Andrew. I have one more question, actually. So how will I be notified when a projected application is ready to start, or what if I want to start sooner than the projected date?
Yeah, great question. So for instance, if you go off this, these like renewals, for instance, so this is a really easy one to kind of picture how this would work. Is for an H-1B or extension or renewal, I should say. If you set it at the 4-month mark, for instance, it's going to send you an email at 4 months to ask you to activate that new case. It's going to email you, but it's also going to show up in their timeline, at which point you'll be able to activate via their timeline. I believe we will be also adding a reminder tool so that if you don't activate those cases at the appropriate time, we'll follow up a month or two later just to make sure that we activate that as soon as possible so that we're not dropping the ball on any cases. But you're going to have multiple ways to really activate those new cases and kind of approve them once they show up. But if you do want to open them earlier, for instance, if you really want to get started on this H-1B renewal at the 8-month mark due to the current COVID situation, for instance, we can definitely get that started. And it's basically going to remove that projected case from the timeline and replace it with the new version a little sooner in their timeline.
Okay. I actually have one more question. So are these guidelines set in stone, or can I change them at any time? And how will that affect projected applications?
Yeah, great question. So you can always change them if you update your immigration policy and you feel the need to update these guidelines to obviously match that, which is obviously a huge component of this. You can definitely toggle them differently to update that.
Oh, thank you. So I really want to know what budgeting is.
Yeah, and I think budgeting is going to be a huge tool for your finance team. I know you've mentioned a few other times that your finance team really wants a little bit more insight into what all these fees are going to and why, I know immigration seems like an exorbitant price at times. This is going to be a great tool to kind of provide some helpful data and a really visual tool so that they understand what we're working with in terms of these prices. So as you'll see at the top, there's going to be this spending, which is going to show you all previous applications that have been opened, and then all projected applications based on those guidelines you set on the previous page. As you'll see, we're going to use green to indicate paid invoices, yellow for those due invoices that are pending and have already been sent over to you, and then this gray or silver is going to show projected applications based on those guidelines that you've set. Any questions about kind of this spending or the summary, which you can kind of see here, which is also going to kind of give you a different visual for that same data in terms of splitting it based on the application type and how much you've spent on each.
Yeah, is there a way I can pull this as a report?
Yeah, so again, definitely feel free to utilize this as much as possible with your finance team. You can actually pull this report in a few different ways. You can use an Excel sheet if you're a little old school and want to use the Microsoft Office suite. We also had a CSV and a print option. All three of these should pull fairly similarly in terms of the actual layout of that data, but we just wanted to give a few different options so that you can save that properly and kind of meet your internal tools and resources.
Cool. So I see a lot of projected costs. How are those calculated?
Yeah, so the projected costs are going to all be based on those guidelines. So for instance, if you say that, you'll start an extension at the 6-month mark, it's going to show all of the projected applications for the next year, I believe, for 18 months, based on those projected applications. So for instance, we're showing up to September 2021. It's not going to show every projected case where the person expires before September 2021. It's also going to show any cases that will be opened by then. So it may include applications where the individual expires in later in 2021 or early 2022. So it's really based on the projected applications based on these guidelines rather than anything set in stone or any cases that have been previously opened. Again, kind of keep using the word projected, but it's based on these projections of what you've already set and what your employee population has already shown in terms of their current expiration dates.
Cool.
All right.
Okay. Yeah, I really want to hear about cost analysis too.
Yeah, So here's where we give a little bit more of a leeway for you to kind of play around with these tools and see how that's going to affect your average costs for each case type. This is a really useful way, as you know, in working with us, that each case kind of operates a little differently. That includes pricing, whether or not an RFE is issued or whether or not the person has 1 dependent, 0 dependents, or 5 dependents, as well as whether or not they need a translation or an education evaluation. That's going to affect these costs in a fairly significant way, depending on the case type. This way, you're going to be able to kind of toggle based on projected or estimated costs to get a better sense of what you're going to be spending in the future. We found that this is a really helpful way to not provide a precise specific amount for each case. Obviously, we can never predict everything that's going to be incurred over the next year or so, but it's going to be a better way to kind of gain a sense of, based on our current RFE rate, for instance, we can expect these additional costs per case. The way this works is if you had chosen to cover premium processing, for instance, it's going to add that premium processing cost of $14.40 to each case that we can include that to. You'll see that added in this variable section. So these base estimates are just the bare minimums. This is going to be the inherent cost of opening this application and completing it via those preparation fees as well as filing fees, and then that base forecast cost. This variable section is going to encompass all of these, toggled options. And then it's going to adjust and then give you kind of an adjusted forecasted cost. So going beyond the premium processing, the dependence coverage, you chose to cover dependents. So it's going to show on average an extra $936. It's going to basically divide that depending on the dependent's rate. So you're going to actually kind of, it's a little formulaic in terms of how this is going to populate in this variable section. But based on how you've currently toggled it at 10%, this dependence coverage is going to be applied to 10% of your cases, but it's actually going to be split per case. It's an easier way to kind of visualize it. And so we've used that so that you'll see that $94 per case, which is approximately 10% of that $936, which we found to be the average cost of adding dependents to a case. The RFE rate, similar, is going to apply the average RFE cost for a case, but applying it based on that 10%, which you've currently toggled. This is going to range depending on the type of RFE, obviously. As we've discussed previously, there are a range of RFE types and therefore a range of costs involved. For some of our lengthier, more in-depth RFEs, they're going to be a bit more expensive. And then it really depends on the type of case or application. I know working with you, we've had quite a few L1s RFE'd recently, and unfortunately that kind of matches what we've seen across the board from USCIS. We're hoping that decreases in the future, but it might be helpful to kind of toggle that rate a little higher for now to gauge what those costs may entail for the next 6 months or so and see whether or not that helps you kind of project your costs with your finance team a little bit more helpfully. But again, I just want to kind of call out that this really does kind of depend on your specific program. You do a lot of TNs as well. And most of your TNs before the COVID crisis, at least, were done at the border. Those are obviously not going to be RFE. So those cases, you won't see RFE rates included. So it may make sense to keep it at 10% to kind of balance out those two, the two application types that you see the most between the L1s and the TN. And then these additional fees, as I mentioned, are going to include kind of those ad hoc additional costs that may be incurred, including a translation of a foreign, marriage certificate or a diploma. It also will include academic evaluations or expert opinion letters that we may need to secure for an application. And then they'll also include the recruitment costs for perms. So you can range this from $10 to $10,000. And you'll see how that obviously is added to each case type here. So, based on your average, application that we've done, we've seen that a lot of your cases do require an academic evaluation. We've done a lot of F1 employees that have never done an H1B before. So I think it's helpful to kind of set this at maybe the $500 mark, because that's going to be a useful way to gauge those additional costs that kind of creep in as we're starting with a case that you might not have been aware of from the start. But based on, again, your employee population, I think it's fair to set that at $500 because of the academic evaluations and potentially the translation of those foreign diplomas and transcripts. Any questions?
No, you've actually done a really good job of explaining this, but is there anything that I can send to like my accounting team, any material to show them exactly what I'm working with?
Yeah, so we actually have two different documents that I'll shoot you over after this call that are really helpful one-pagers. And they're going to help you walk through this, kind of dumb it down a little bit and put it into layman's terms for someone that's not using the Bridge platform on a day-to-day basis, so that you can kind of communicate this with the rest of your team that aren't Bridge users. Um, and then again, I highly suggest exporting these. I want to just kind of call out that you can also export this cost analysis page so that you can kind of send that over and talk through to your CFO or, your AP team to kind of understand where these costs are coming into play. And then obviously feel free to fall back on us and let us know how we can help in terms of communicating that to the rest of your team. And obviously, as I mentioned, highly suggest playing around with this a bit. And then, feel free to come back to me and let me know if you have any questions or if you want to set up another call to go over this in more detail.
Thank you so much, Andrew.